you. Tonight I'm going to talk about, or Gary has asked me to talk about, marriage and why is it so important. Now I know coming to a college group and talking about marriage is probably not the best topic in the world necessarily, simply because everybody's thinking, ugh, marriage, I'll get to that eventually, like I'm still trying to get through school right now, I've got exams coming up. And I totally get it, I totally understand that. I think you're absolutely right in thinking that way. However, I will say that if you don't think seriously about marriage now, when the time comes, you may make some mistakes along the way. And I don't want you to make any mistakes, but even more importantly, I think this issue of marriage has become increasingly important in the current culture that we live in, simply because we have seen a redefinition of marriage that has radically changed not only marriage and the institution of marriage, but actually the entire culture in which we now live. And it is massively impacting even things like religious freedom and expression and freedom of speech and all that kind of stuff. As Gary said, I run a ministry that helps folks with sexual and relational brokenness in their life. That stems the gamut of anything you can imagine, from abuse to gender confusion, to homosexuality, addictions, those kind of things. And so what I deal with on a daily basis are folks who often are struggling with what happens when we choose to follow a way of sexuality that differs from what the Creator designed us for. And as a result of that, we see some pretty amazing and radical consequences of those wrong choices, but we also see incredible acts of God's grace and mercy in people's lives to redeem them from some of the addictive things that they've become involved with, or some of the bad choices they've made, in order to allow the gospel to be set free in their hearts and lives. So it's a beautiful and a privileged, I feel, opportunity to walk with people to see the gospel come alive in people's lives. So tonight, as we talk about this topic of marriage and why is marriage so important, I'm going to take a lot of not a lot, but some of the information I talk about tonight from a friend of mine, John Stonestreet, and his buddy, Sean McDowell, who I also know, but I'm just not a friend with him that I can say we're friends. You know, I could say that I'm friends, but I'm really not like friends. I mean, I know him, he knows me, but we're not friends. But John, but I mean, like we're friendly, but I'm like, I don't have his number where I can call him and say, hey man, you know, it's Ricky. But on John, I actually have John's number, and we really are friends, and we do talk on occasion. But anyway, that's just name dropping, and it's not really important. So, but anyway, he wrote this book called Same-Sex Marriage, and it was really interesting because he wrote it, and I was looking, I didn't realize it, but he wrote it actually in 2014. He and Sean wrote it in 2014, and it was in 2015 that same-sex marriage became a thing. And so it's kind of fascinating, some of the stuff he talks about and the way he talks about it, realizing that the next year, the very things he talked about in here would in fact become true and radically change a lot of stuff, which is really cool. Anybody here ever been to Summit in Colorado? Anybody do Summit? You did? When did you do it? Long time ago. Okay. Well, that's cool. I teach at Summit in the summer times, or I have. Did you hear me there? I'm sorry. Yeah, but it's this great ministry that talks about Christian worldviews and being able to understand the world from a Christian worldview perspective. They do some really awesome stuff. If you ever get opportunity to go there, you should. So, jumping right in tonight, let's talk about why is marriage so important, and why does God put such a high esteem on marriage? Why does he talk about it the way he does? Why is it important? And if you have your Bibles, I'm going to start it from the very beginning, which I always think is a really good place to start when we start looking at origins of things. We always want to start at what's the beginning. And what we find in the beginning, in chapter 1 of Genesis, is that God is actually the one who creates this thing called marriage, this coupling of man and woman. And he does this in the first chapter. He starts off in verse 26, we'll pick it up there. God said a whole lot of things prior to this, and things became, which is really significant, because when he gets to verse 26, he does something very different than the things that he did prior. Prior to this, everything he's creating, he's speaking, and things are becoming. Okay? But then we get to verse 26, and it says, "And God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over it and over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." So God comes along here in Genesis chapter 1, and what he does in Genesis chapter 1 is that he is the one who is initiating this idea of marriage, and he starts out by saying, first, there is going to be this form of male and female, and this form is going to have a purpose to fill the earth. And so when we first think about marriage, I think one of the things we have to ask ourselves is, it came from God, and it came from God's heart, and it came to allow us to somehow reflect something about God into the world that we live in. Now, it's kind of fascinating to me because when you think about that, I think there's so many other ways, if I had been God, that I could have reflected myself in the world that would have been different than creating these creatures, this man and this woman. And yet God said, no, I really want this image of man and this image of woman to somehow image me in the world. And so what's so beautiful about that to me is the diversity and complexity that is revealed about God in the male-female complementary reality that exists in humanity. You see, when I look out onto the audience tonight, what I see are a whole bunch of different people that have very different faces, very different bodies, very different lives. They're just really different, yet each one of you, both male and female, somehow reflect the image of God and the beauty of God in a way that communicates truth to me and all of the rest of the world. Now, how cool is that? That gives you incredible inherent worth and value simply because of your created self, because you reflect something of God. And I would go further to say that because literally half of you, I mean, I don't know if it's exactly 50%, but as I look out at the crowd, I see two kinds of people, male individuals and female individuals. I think those gender and sex things go together. And so I see male individuals and female individuals that actually do look different and in fact are different, both biologically, psychologically, physically. I mean, just any kind of way you want to look at it, we're very different. But yet that female person and that male person also reflect God simultaneously. And so I look at that and think, wow, the fullness of the mystery and the majesty of God is so profound that a simple individual couldn't express the fullness of all that he is, that we existed in both male and female. And then it also says that man is going to leave, in chapter 2, his mother and father and cling to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. Now, that's an interesting thing because when we get to the New Testament, what we see Jesus talking about when he's asked about marriage, and particularly when he's asked about divorce, he's kind of asked in the negative, he answers in the positive, which is kind of a real cool thing that Jesus kind of does pretty often. He's just slick like that. But he comes out and says, well, actually, it was not God's intention from the very beginning. He says to us, he created them male and female, and for this reason a man will leave his mother and father and cling to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. That's interesting. I always thought this passage was rather interesting about being made in the image of God and becoming one flesh, because the reality is there was no father and mother for Adam and Eve to leave, right? So when it says, and they will leave their mother and father and cling to their spouse and become one flesh, I think, well, what did that mean? Why is that there? Like, they were the first belly buttonless couple. I mean, just think about it. Like, they were created beings. They weren't born beings. They didn't have an umbilical connection to their parents. They were just created by God. They were fashioned by God. Adam was breathed into him, life, and then Eve was extracted from Adam. Okay? So you have an extracted one and a breathed in one that has been created, and yet he's talking about it, and I'm thinking, why did that happen? Well, I think it's there because God knew, because it was all just a moment to him, that in Matthew 19, when Jesus would show up in the world, he would say, well, wait a minute, I need to let you know that my understanding of how God intends all of this to be was male and female coming together in a monogamous, committed, faithful relationship for life, because this is what God's intention was. So Jesus, by not necessarily addressing the specifics of what they were asking him, actually elevated and raised up the standard and said, listen, the reason you were granted divorce was because of the hardness of your heart. Moses made an accommodation for you, but if you want to know what God's intention is that a man would leave his mother and father and cling to his wife, and the two would become one flesh. So it's established by God, this marriage commitment, this institution, as we sometimes call it, was established by God, and believe it or not, it really exists and is evident in every society in the world that has been found. There is something inherent in the heart of man that is drawn toward a coupling with someone of the opposite sex. There is this inherent draw toward this matrimonial reality that we see. Now, it takes different forms, and because of sin in the world, it sometimes can get messed up. But the reality is we continue to find marriage, or this institution of marriage, in almost every society that we've discovered. Humans can't create marriage. It wasn't something we decided upon or picked. It's actually something that simply was acknowledged by the reality of its existence as it was revealed in human behavior. Now that's pretty cool when you think about it. To me, it's very much like sex and gender, though I would have folks that would disagree with me strongly at this point. Actually, they probably disagree with me since I started. But anyway, they would disagree with me on the sex and gender being together, because I don't believe that like sex is assigned at birth. I think sex is revealed at birth. It is evidentiary by the reality of the sex of the child, by the genitalia that is presented. And one looks at the child and goes, oh, look, it's a boy. Or, oh, look, it's a girl. And everybody kind of knows that it is, like little kindergartners that might be present, although it would be kind of weird. But even those who might be present, they look at the baby and they go, oh, it's a little boy. Oh, it's a little girl. Like they know. Why? Because we didn't create it. We don't name it. We don't claim it. We just acknowledge what God has already done. It's a self-evident reality. And it was so apparent and so obvious that for literally thousands of years, nobody ever questioned anything about it until like maybe the last 35, 40 years. We decided to start having some questions about that. We've become so bright and so smart and so clever that we've decided that somehow our mentality and understanding of reality has trumped the creative reality of God in the beautiful diversity of his creation, which is kind of crazy to me, but you know, it's what we humans do. It's all about the sin. So where did marriage come from? It came from God. It's created by God, and it's revealed to us and acknowledged by us in the recognition of the practices of humanity to gather together and to become one. But why is it so important? I mean, okay, so God created it, that's cool, but then why is it really important? Like, is it really important? Is it critical? Well, I think it is. I'll give you 5 little things real quick. Number 1, God established it as the first form of human community. So right off the bat, when he said that that man should not be alone, he created, and notice he doesn't say that man should not be lonely. Man wasn't lonely, okay? Man was just, he said, man should not be alone in the sense that he couldn't do what he was kind of designed to do alone. He needed someone else. He needed a complement in order to do that. So God created the woman as a helper. A helper for what? It wasn't a helper to accomplish chores. They had animals that could do that, and we've always used animals. Historically, man has always used animals to accomplish tasks in the world. But there was a specific kind of help that the man needed that could only be accomplished by a complement who also was a human. And that was the production of another human. Okay? And so God established this first community with these two people And that first community, number two, is a reflection of the oneness of God and his glory in the earth. Because when this man and this woman come together, there is a literal sense from a physiological standpoint, anatomically, where the man and the woman join together in intercourse, and so there is a union of the two of them, so to speak. But even in more precise terms than that, there is a contribution on the part of the man and a contribution on the part of the woman that actually come together, and half a chromosome over here and a chromosome over here come together and form a new human who becomes a one from the two. Are you following me so far? Now, when you think about that as a reflection of God's glory into the world, you realize how unbelievable and incredible and amazing that act of sexuality and intercourse that ultimately brings forth a life is a beautiful reflection of the oneness of God who exists in Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. How cool is that? That all of a sudden these two individuals with the power of God's creative Holy Spirit at work therefore brings forth this one who comes forth from the results of the three. Spirit, male, female. Does that make sense? Are you following me so far? Are you tracking with me? Okay. Are you disagreeing with me yet? Okay, I'll work harder. Number two. All right, so that was number two, reflection of God's oneness. Number three, it's a picture of God's relationship to the church. Okay? And Paul talks about this a good bit. He talks about it in 2 Corinthians 11:2, where he talks about the reality of the beauty of God's creation in relationship to us being betrothed to Christ as his bride, and that day of redemption, he's coming back as the bridegroom to redeem us. We see that also in Revelation, where in John's Revelation, in the book of Revelation, where he has created this banquet feast and this feast for his bride, and he comes to receive his bride, which is all of us, which is kind of interesting because basically in the redemption story of God, when he comes back, we're all feminine in a sense. We're all responsive to God, and he is the groom, and all of us collectively as the church of God are the bride. So there's a sense in which we're all feminine at that point. I know that just blows the mind of some of my friends, but nonetheless, just hang with it. It works out in the end. And so, it's this beautiful story of redemption. So this picture of God's relationship to the church is really portrayed throughout all of Scripture by this male-female complementary connection in marriage, in a committed relationship that has fidelity and integrity. And so we see that there beautifully, beautifully exemplified. And it's all the way through the arc of Scripture. I mean, from the beginning to the end, from literally Genesis to Revelation, we see God particularly, over and over again using the image of the marriage as a way for us to understand Christ and the church, which is pretty awesome. We never see that example given of any other union except a male and a female. It's never talked about in terms of male-male or female-female. It's never talked in terms of just friendship, intimate connection, and family even. It's always talked about in terms of a male-female marital relationship and that intimacy that's there. Number four, it reflects God as creator in the world. He says in this verse 28 of Genesis 1, that God blessed them and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it." Now that's an incredibly powerful, theological, rich statement, because what God is saying by telling us that is that he is, number one, instructing and initiating the instruction for sexual relating. One of the things I talk about sex a lot in the things that I talk about. Like, have any of you heard me talk about sex before? If you've been here for a while, yeah, I talk about it a lot. But it's kind of what I do. I'm kind of the sex minister guy. But yeah, I won't tell you the other things they call me. It's not nearly as nice. But but nonetheless, I do talk a lot about sex. And one of the things that I say about sex is the fact that God is the one who created it, and sex and holiness actually go together, which are two words that in most churches today we don't think of together at all. Matter of fact, most of the time when I say that it's a holy thing to have sex, people kind of snicker because they can't imagine sexuality and holiness going together. Because typically when we say sex in the world in which we live, we always think of something negative or something dirty or something obscene or somehow dark. When in fact we see the author of sex is actually God. God says, be fruitful and multiply. Or to put it in a more modern vernacular, he's like, hey, go get busy. I mean, that's kind of what he's saying. All right. And in fact, I would say that he says get very busy, very, very busy, because they have to populate the entire world. Okay, this isn't like we're going to start a small, homeschool co-op. I mean, it's not that kind of thing. This is we need to actually populate the entire earth. Okay, so 19 children and counting is like nothing in comparison to what's about to happen here. Okay, this is a busy man and a very often pregnant woman, and so they are getting busy, and God is the one who says this is what you need to do. Be fruitful, and basically what he's saying is part of the created essence of humanity in the reflection of God's glory in the world is that we do what God ultimately was doing. What was God doing in those first 26 verses, 25 verses of Genesis? God was filling the earth with all kinds of creation. God says, guess what? You, as image bearers of me, the created ones of me, your assignment is also going to be to fill the earth. I want you now to fill the earth, and despite the fact that I'm the sovereign Lord who is in charge of everything, I am going to give or delegate part of my sovereignty to you by giving you dominion over this earth in which you will now live. That's a pretty massive distribution of power, okay? God says, hey, I want you to fill the earth, go subdue it, and then I want you to have dominion over it. Now, that's significant because later in chapter 3, when sin enters the picture, the fact that we have this dominion means that you and I as humans can often do things which go counter to the truths of God and to the teachings of God and to the best intentions of God for us, and yet still make it happen. And so when I'm asked questions about I know people, they'll say to me, that have a gay relationship and they're married and they're like, they totally have a great life. Like they have a great life. I'm like, okay. So what does that prove? Well, it proves that, God must be blessing them. I was like, really? How does that prove that? Well, because if God didn't like it, their lives would be maybe miserable. And I'm like, well, maybe not. I know a lot of people who are really lost that are super happy. They're super happy. They're super rich. They have all kinds of things. They have great things going for them. Just because a person happens to be happy in any given moment and any given circumstances doesn't mean that everything is good and that they're living by God's rules and regulations and doing God's will. As humans, we are capable of doing all kinds of things. And because we are made a little lower than the angels, and because we have been given this dominion, the reality is you and I can do almost anything. Everything may be lawful for us, but not everything is needful or necessary. Okay? As Paul would put it. So the reality is you and I can do lots of sinful things that we can get by with, so to speak, for a period of time. But ultimately, that isn't God's best for us. And so my hope and prayer for all of us is that we would not simply do, what we can because we can, but we would do what is best because we trust the one who knows what is best. And I would hope that we live out that kind of reality. So God says, be fruitful and multiply, have dominion. Male and females fully reflect the reality of God as image bearers of him. We reflect that into the world, and people see that and need to see that in us. Fifthly, it is the only way this man and woman coming together, having conjugal relations, is the only way in which new life happens, male and female. And that's pretty significant, which is why it's such a unique and particularly relegated or regulated, I should say, not relegated, but regulated reality, and such a important reality for both sacred and secular, if you want to make those kinds of divisions, people, believers and non-believers, okay? everyone participates in marriage, not just Christian people. Secular people who don't believe in God at all see marriage as something that's kind of a necessary reality. And the truth of the matter is, it is the only way in which life comes forth into the world. So what more beautiful way as image bearers, which every single human being is an image bearer, all of us are made in the image of God, whether you believe in God or not. We, as image bearers in the general sense, get to bring forth life into the world, which is what God is all about. God says he's about life, and he wants to give us life more abundantly. So God is able to allow all of us to reflect, in some ways, the image of God. Obviously, we reflect it more fully if we know him and follow him and trust him and obey him. But even those who don't, there is a sense in which their bringing forth of life is, in a very real way, a reflection of who he is. And, sixthly and finally, it's the only biological function that humans cannot do alone. I can pretty much do everything else biologically in my body all by myself. I don't need another person, need anybody to help her biologically with her biological realities, except when it comes to producing new life. I absolutely have to have a woman. And there is no new life that's ever been created that a woman and a man was not intimately involved in the reality of that new life. Now, I know you're thinking, well, what about, test tube babies and all that? Well, okay, yeah, chemically and technologically, we have come a long way and can do some pretty incredible things. Once again, why? Because we have dominion over the earth, and God has given us that, and sin is confusing and corrupting some of that. But the reality is, even in those cases, there is still something that is taken from a man and something that is taken from a woman, joined together and put together, and then implanted at some point into a woman who then brings forth life into the world. That's still how babies get here. And that is going to be how babies get here. I mean, that is the way God has created new life. And so it is super important that we protect this reality. And also, I think it's important from a sociological perspective, and it's one of the reasons why you see regulations about marriage, is because the state decided that it had an interest in the protection of this male-female coupling because, and really only because, it brought forth new citizens into the world. And cultures need new citizens. Why? Because 100% of those of you seated here will in fact expire. You're all dying. That's the good news or the bad news, however you want to look at it. But everybody's here dying. I know some of you wish you would die before your exams, but I mean, I've had that prayer many times. Lord, please take me before this exam. Matter of fact, Lord, please take me before the study part for this exam. That would be better. But then when it gets real bad, it's like, Lord, just take me any time that I won't have to go through. But, it doesn't happen. So just keep studying. But it's one of those things that, honestly, I mean, it's amazing. It's an amazing reality that the government has taken interest in this because it knew and it knows, and it's been proven sociologically and scientifically, that children that are raised in male-female homes, committed, monogamous, and stable, actually perform better, do better in every measurable category that any kind of social scientist look at. They simply do better, okay? It's always been fascinating to me, the incredible bond between a child and a parent. It's just amazing, the strong bonds that are there. I can remember when I was a youth pastor for years and years, we'd often have foster kids that would come into our ministry because we had wonderful Christian people who would foster these kids. And I remember one young man who was in our youth ministry, and he had come from this incredibly dysfunctional home who had really tortured him, literally. They had put his feet on these furnace grates in these old homes. They have a little cross hatch kind of furnaces that would get real hot. They had put his feet on there, and he had these scarring all over the bottom of his feet. They put out cigarettes on him. They beat him. They locked him up in a closet. I mean, they just did all these horrific things. And needless to say, he had some issues. But he is now with this incredible Christian family, and he was with them for 3 or 4 years by the time I met him, and he was then with them 3 or 4 more years as a part of the youth group, and then probably it was 6 or 7 years he had been with them, living with them, had done really well, had recovered a lot from some of the traumas that he had experienced as a young child. And one day, the mom of this little boy shows up, and she's just in tears, and she's upset, and I'm like, what's going on? What happened? And she said, the social worker came out to the house, and they said that, his mother of the little boy had finally gotten to the place where she had recovered from her addictions and all the things that she was involved in. She's gone through a bunch of programs. She's doing much better. And now, because of his age, they're going to give him the option to be able to go back to his mother, his birth mother, if he wants to. And I thought to myself initially, surely he will not choose to do that. Like, this is a really bad move. Who would ever want to go back when you have this incredible family that you've been living with for the last 6 years, and they've taken care of you, you're now 15, 16 years old, you've got enough sense to go, whoa, I don't want to go back to that dysfunction, I'm going to stay with these people, it's nice and stable, I have brothers and sisters that really love me and care about me, have a great church and a community, all that, you're going to stay. And sure enough, you know what his decision was? Go back to his family. And in the years that passed, I saw many, many, many more foster kids who came through that were in terribly abusive situations, who knowingly chose to go back to their family of origin because it was their family of origin. There is something incredibly powerful about the connection between moms and dads and their children that I think everybody longs for. It's one of the issues that often is dealt with children who are adopted, even though we're really big on adoption and think it's a great thing. We've all been adopted in the kingdom of God. The reality is many times kids who are adopted struggle with feelings of abandonment, want to know who their original parents were. They want to know why and what. They want to meet them and all those sorts of things that take place because we have that longing to connect to our biological reality. So that's why it's important. It's why the government gets involved in it. It's why we ought to be concerned about it. Well, what's happened real quickly? What has happened to marriage? Okay, so we looked at why is marriage, where did it come from? Why is it important? Now what happened to it? Well, what changed? Well, what changed is sin. In Genesis 3, we see man disobeying God and falling, and one of the ways that he does that is the devil begins to deceive. He says in verse 1 there of the chapter 3, Satan comes up to Eve and says, "Did God really say?" And that really begins the end of man in the garden, because what happens is, as you know, man begins to doubt the veracity of God's commands and the truth of those commands and believes that somehow he could have a better way to do what it is that God wants him to do. James 1 says that we're all drawn away. We are enticed by our own evil desires, and then when lust is conceived, it brings forth sin, and when sin is conceived, it brings forth death. And so, sure enough, one of the realities of our existence is because of our sin, we're drawn away from God, and in that process of being drawn away, sin happens. Now, in a more practical, specific kind of way, what took place for us, kind of in a worldview standpoint, just in our recent history, is Darwin happened in the origin of the species right around 1859 when it came out. And what Darwin did is say, well, wait a minute, I don't believe in this God. I believe that there's an evolutionary process that took place of random selection that allowed humans to sort of generate from the reality of matter, and they became who they are. And so there was this real challenge of God, and things began to shift. And then we had Margaret Sanger, who came up and decided that sex really was the thing that would free mankind and allow them to feel better about themselves. So in 1915, she started Planned Parenthood and decided that the sexual revolution and birth control would actually free women from the confines of bearing children, and sex could be enjoyed by all without any penalty or consequence. And then you had Alfred Kinsey, good old Kinsey, as perverted as he was, in about 1948, where he came out with the Kinsey Report that sought to normalize that which really wasn't normal at all. And so he put forth all kinds of ideas about how if sex happened by any human being at any place in the world, that whatever that sex was, however perverse it might be, was in fact normal for the expression of sex within humanity. So therefore, things which beforehand had been considered absolutely taboo were now embraced as normative within the culture. And that began to be taught pretty significantly. Hugh Hefner, I don't know if you know who Hugh Hefner is at all, but you may. Hugh Hefner, the publisher of Playboy, was kind of the artist, if you will, that then took some of those Kinseyan ideas and began to put those out in picture form and in story form, and began to change a bit of the culture in a pretty big way. And then you had Mary Calderon, who in 1964, with the Sexual Information and Education Council of the United States, which actually still is in existence, took Kinsey's ideas and Hefner's ideas and basically codified them into curriculum, which was then given and taught in American public schools as sex education. And that is still being used in some places today, and she's called the most influential resource of sex education in American public schools. And then, believe it or not, in 1969, one of the presidents, who is oftentimes considered the most admired in recent history in conservative circles, the governor, Ronald Reagan, being governor of California in 1969, signed a law that allowed for no-fault divorce. Now you say, well, why is that such a big deal? It's a huge deal because all of a sudden marriage, which is supposed to be between a male and a female, have fidelity, have monogamy, and have permanence, suddenly became not so permanent. And so no-fault divorce allowed anybody to get a divorce for any reason. It was simply the breaking of a contract. And so they simply would break the contract. Well, by 1970, the divorce rates in America just absolutely skyrocketed because of that. In the process of that, I think what we also did is change the definition of love. Because when most folks married prior to 70, marriage was considered to be something, yes, you loved the person, but more importantly, you were committed to the good of that person, and you were willing to sacrifice for the good of that person. Marriage was much more about the family and the establishment of family and the securing of progeny that would then continue on in your legacy, and suddenly became something that we did in order to satisfy our own desires, our own pleasures, our own sexual prowess or emotional need. And so now, with this change, we have a change in the definition and a redefinition of love that was even more vividly exemplified in the Roe v. Wade case in 1973, where suddenly the woman's right to privacy under the 14th Amendment became the thing that then allowed the world to say, hey, the most important thing is not life, it's not what's happened between two consenting adults, this is about actual pleasure and satisfaction and freedom and rights for the woman. And so suddenly we see a definition of love that says it's all about what makes me happy and what is pleasing to me. And then in 2015, we had a massive shift in the definition of marriage, where we no longer called marriage that which exists between a man and a woman for the purpose of reproduction, but now that which exists between also people of the same sex who are together, who want to also say that they have a marriage. Now, the problem with that definition is that when you look at the logic that's used to get that decision, what that really does and will in fact do is it opens up every person who wants to be connected to another person or feels as though they have an inclination to be connected to another person, to be connected to that person in something like a marriage or something called a marriage. There's no reason we shouldn't have polygamy, polyandry, any of those things should be absolutely permissible, because the logic that was used for the decision, if true, then merits just by law and reason that these other kinds of connections should also be true. For instance, there really can't be, or shouldn't be, if the logic is true, a restriction between siblings marrying, or between incestuous relationships, between a father and children. If that's something that they wanted to do, felt inclined to do, felt loving feelings toward each other, then they should do that. The beauty and uniqueness of marriage, and the reason why it was elevated and protected, is because it is the one union that brought forth life into the world, and it was designed by God, not by man. That is very, very different than everything else. It's not discriminatory to say that two people of the same can't have marriage because they don't have marriage. Marriage is between a man and a woman in order to bring forth children. That is really the purpose of marriage. It has a procreative reality that's there. And if that's not there, then it really isn't marriage. And I know some of you would say, well, wait a minute, Ricky, what about those opportunities where a person can't bring forth children into the world. Do they not have a marriage? Well, yes, they have a marriage. It just happens to be because of the fall and because of sin that they can't procreate in that same way. Maybe something's not right, but the reality is they still have a marriage because they have the potential for that possibility to exist, whereas two people of the same have no potential for that possibility to exist. It cannot happen. And we believe that people really need moms and dads. There is something that is given to the child by the understanding of both male and female that allows them to be the functional, good creations of God that they are, because they need to see both the masculine reflection of God and the feminine reflection of God to understand who God is. Now, what can we do? Last thing, real quick. What can we do? We got to teach and embrace and practice God's word. We need to know what it is and teach it in a way that we live it out in our lives. We need to live out committed, vibrant, marital lives. Lots of you here have had incredible parents. Some of you here have not had such great parents. And you're saying to yourself, man, if that's what marriage is, I want no part of that. And honestly, if that's what marriage is, you shouldn't have any part of that. Maybe it was horrible. It was awful. But that doesn't mean that you can't say, hey, guess what? I'm going to have a different kind of marriage. I didn't grow up in a very healthy home. I had a really dysfunctional home. My mom and dad, though they're still married and have been married over 50 years, probably shouldn't have been. They stayed together. I'm not quite sure why. I do know they love each other. I think it's some real weird kind of way, but they don't get along well. They don't like each other very much. They live in separate bedrooms in a very large house that they don't really talk to each other very often. It's not healthy. It's not good. But nonetheless, I looked at that and said, you know what? I see that what is before me is not what should be, but I bet you I can do better than that. And now I've been able to be married to a woman for 30 years that I adore, and she loves me, and we have this incredible life together of service to God, because that's the focus for us, is this unity with God's reality, and it's been great. So we need to take a strong stance against divorce, which is a real weird thing in today's culture because it's such a common thing because of that 1970 decision by Ronald Reagan, who then swept the country. But we need to take a pretty strong stance against divorce. Marriage is not something that's disposable or transferable easily. It needs to be something that's very hard to get out of, if you can get out of it at all. Number 4, we got to honor and celebrate the uniqueness of being created male and female, and our procreative privilege. We really have a procreative privilege that we get by being created male and female, and we need to celebrate that. I'm excited that the one unique thing that I can do as a male is I can impregnate a woman. And that's awesome. It's really awesome. It's a lot of fun too. But it's a really awesome thing. And you know what, ladies? You need to be excited about the reality that you can receive the seed of life from a man and take that into your body in a way that a new life can come forth from your body. That is so unbelievably beautiful and awesome. And I think we need to celebrate that, not look at that as a liability or as a disease or as some malformity that needs to be transformed into something else. That is the beauty of God's creation in you. I'm excited that I get this one unique thing to do, and I'm excited that all these ladies in this room have one unique thing that they can do. It's the thing that really separates us. Everything else, we pretty much can be interchangeable. We each can do kinds of the same things, but with that one unique thing, I can't hold on to a seed and bring forth life, but I can give seed. That's how God made me, and that's a really cool thing. I think we also have to flee the sexual immorality that is prevalent in our culture. And we need to seek healing for the things that we've both done and have been done to us that needs to be healed and made whole in our life. I'm convinced that God's freedom is not the ability to do whatever we want to do, but it actually is the empowerment to do what God has commanded us to do. That's real freedom. It's not doing anything you want to do. It's being empowered to do what it is that God has commanded us to do. And one of the most beautiful things that God has said to most of us, not all of us, because there will be some who are called to celibacy and singleness, but God has given us this amazing ability to be married to another person. And I hope that you are praying diligently for that partner that God is going to give you, that partner is going to be someone of the opposite gender that you will complement, that you will be able to help, that you will be able to serve. And as Ephesians 5 says, that you're going to love them and respect them and honor them in a way that the world around you looks at the coupling of male and female and says about your union, wow, what is it that they have that we don't have? Because it's beautiful, it's awesome, it's incredible. Look at their family. Look at these children who honor their mother and their father and honor others and serve others. I don't know what they have, but whatever that is, we need to have it too, because it's beautiful, it's flourishing, it's God's best display of himself in the world. And I hope that we can show that forth to others. Let's pray.